So now let's open up our books to page 113, and we're going to talk about land use controls. After we talk about this chapter, you're going to be able to identify the different types of land use controls, what they are, why we use them, and some of the guidelines for them. So one of the first things that you'll see, the intro to the chapter talks about some of the first skyscrapers in our country, and how skyscrapers kind of inspired the need to start controlling a little bit more how land was used so that other people's rights were protected, neighboring land owners. The book defines police power. It's the first bold term that you're going to see, is the state's authority to adopt regulations that are necessary to protect public health and safety and land value. They call that police power. You may or may not see that term used, but it's good to know it exists. If you turn your book to page 114, a more important term for you in practice is going to be knowing what a master plan is. A city's master plan, typically if a city is planning to build new highways or change streets, they're going to have a master plan that extends out 15 or 20 years as to what they are intending to do later. If you're going to be practicing heavily in one certain city or area, it's a good idea to have their master plan in your file so that you can be aware of where the city intends to extend and do construction, especially for highways. So, moving on down page 114, master plan may even include things like zoning changes. Zoning ordinances are defined as laws imposed by local government that regulate and control land use. Zoning ordinances might say that one area is zoned commercial or one area is zoned for residential. So there are different zoning codes that refer to different zoning uses that are allowed. This little list here describes, on the bottom of page 114, describes the types of regulations that zoning might affect. One of the things zoning cannot affect is your basic rights and your basic freedoms with property ownership. So zoning cannot say if you own a house that you can't sell it for 2 years in this neighborhood. You can't sell, okay? Zoning can't say don't play your music after 10 o'clock in this neighborhood. Although if a neighbor is disturbed, they may certainly call the police. The city can't impose that regulation, okay? Zoning affects things like lot sizes, types of structures, building heights, and that basically everything on that list. Not limited to, though. They can control other things. And let's talk a little bit on page 115 about some different types of zoning. One of the things to keep in mind is that zoning is local in nature, which means the federal government will not impose zoning on states. The North Carolina's Enabling Act is what enables certain or all the municipalities to decide how they're going to zone individually. Highlight the second sentence of that second paragraph that says there are no nationwide or statewide zoning regulations. Zoning is local in nature. Now, because zoning is local in nature, it's important to check with the city if there's ever a question about a zoning thing. So you might have a buyer ask you, hey, I want to buy this property. Do you think I could put a duplex on it? Do you think I could raise chickens do you think I could have a dog farm here? So you're going to hear buyers ask you questions like that. And as brokers, it is your job not to be an expert on what zoning can occur where. It's your job to know where to send the buyer for the right information. 9 out of 10 times that answer is call the city, call the zoning department, and talk to them about it. Because they're the experts in zoning, right? We're the experts in brokerage. They are the experts in zoning. Our job is to help them discover where to find the right information, okay? And it's not just a look online kind of thing. You want to guide them that, to talk to somebody. When it comes to a special use they might have in mind for a piece of property, okay? There are a couple of different zoning terms you're going to see in this text. So you're going to see in the middle of that third paragraph, you're going to see cluster zoning in bold. Cluster zoning is when a developer can provide the same number of housing units as traditional subdivision, but with large tracts of open space. So he might have a large tract of open space and then cluster of homes. Okay, so he's got a whole piece of property and it's a planned unit development, and he's going to have some open space and some houses. So it's not going to be all houses tied together, okay? You also see in the book in the next paragraph buffer zones, such as landscape, parks, and playground. This is typically used in communities that are subdivided, and they want to have buffer zones in between the structures, or in between the houses, or if it's apartments, maybe in between the apartment buildings, okay? So a buffer zone is really just that, it's a buffer, okay? A lot of times when they're constructing a new highway, they will build or they'll plant or put a long line of trees or something that protects the neighboring properties from the noise of the highway. And that's also considered a buffer or a buffer zone. Okay? Zoning ordinances are typically, and I'm now in the paragraph, second to last on 115. Zoning ordinances are typically within corporate limits. Corporate limits, just a fancy way of saying city limits. There are areas right outside of the city limits that could eventually become subject to city zoning ordinances and city taxes, and they call those extraterritorial jurisdictions, or ETJs. You may or may not see that term later, but what you're going to want to know about ETJs is that they are the area right outside of the city limits that are very likely next to get annexed by the city. You know how the city grows and extends its limits every year? If you get a buyer client who says, I want to live near the city but not in the city because I don't want to pay city taxes, and you move them a mile or two right outside of the city, they should be made aware that it is likely, because they're so close to the city limit, that they could potentially become subject sooner than later to the same city ordinances, zoning ordinances, city taxes, city trash pickup, that kind of thing. And we call that, again, that small area around of city limits, ETJs. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the book mentions it here on the bottom of page 115. Zoning ordinances can't violate the rights of the property owner. okay? There are constitutional rights, the rights associated with having title to a property. Ordinances have to be free from discrimination, and they can't, again, zoning can't say don't play your music after 10. Maybe a apartment can ask that, maybe, but there can't be a zoning law that says that. I have a property listed in Winston-Salem, and I'm on page 116 now. I'm going to give you an example of this next term, legal non-conforming use, which is very likely one of the test questions you're going to see here on your test. I have a listing in Winston-Salem. It is a house, and it is zoned for light business. So they have the zoning code LB. I'm like, okay. It's right next to a Family Dollar and a gas station, but it's been a house for the duration of its existence. When I got the listing, I was like, wow, this is awesome. I wonder what could somebody put here? What does light business mean? Right? So I called the city and I said, can this house continue to be used as a house? And her exact response was, using the property as a house is a legal, non-conforming use, meaning it's being used as a house even though it is zoned for business. So that's considered a legal non-conforming use because its use as a house was kind of grandfathered in. It was being used as a house before the zoning ever got changed. And it's still being used as a house. She said, but if somebody modifies the structure, or if they decide to put a business there and use it for zoning, then that legal non-conforming use becomes obsolete. So legal non-conforming use, meaning kind of like a grandfathered in use of a property, is typically not not permitted to continue forever, indefinitely. In the second paragraph there, it gives you a couple of examples of what might change that. If the building is destroyed and has to be reconstructed, if the property can only be maintained but not necessarily improved, meaning it can't be built out or made bigger or have all these changes made to it. And furthermore, in the last sentence, a real estate broker should never guarantee the use of a property for any reason. So for this property that's a house but is zoned light business, I had to make sure that I properly disclosed that, sure, it's a house now, but here's who you want to speak to if you have questions about what else you want to use that property for. The lady at the city would not tell me what the property could be used for. She simply said, if a purchaser wishes to change the use, they have to apply for a permit with the city. And then the city determines if that use of that property is acceptable. So a legal non-conforming use, that's the perfect example of one. A house that's been being used as a house forever, but it's in a business, it's in a commercial zone. It's an area that has been rezoned for commercial. Okay? Now, an illegal use is just an illegal use, okay? So if there is a neighborhood of 100 homes and one of those property owners decides he's going to put a gas station in his neighborhood, and he does, that would be considered an illegal use, even if it goes on for 50 years. Even if he never gets caught by the city, even if he sells it twice, sells it and then someone sells it again, a property that is being used as an illegal, with an illegal use or under a zoning law that it doesn't comply with, that can be taken away at any time, okay? Then there are, so for example, if you saw a test question that said, if a man builds a gas station in a neighborhood and he operates for 25 years, what type of use is this? A, legal non-conforming, B, historic zoning, C, illegal use, or D, overlay district. Right, an illegal use. And with all these different terms throughout the chapter, it's very likely you're going to see test questions like that, where they give you a scenario and then they give you 4 zoning terms to choose from, and you have to choose which one applies. Okay? Now, there are also things called zoning variations, and I'm going to try to really simplify the difference between a conditional use permit and a variance, because I feel like, even though it's been many years, I feel like that was definitely a topic for one of the test questions. So, zoning may have a conditional use permit, or a special use permit as the book AKAs it, is for a property owner who wants to use their property in a special way that's in the public interest, such as maybe a church or a school or something like that. And maybe they're in a neighborhood of 100 houses, and they're like, you know what, I'd really like to turn my property into a church. It will benefit the neighborhood. They have to apply for a conditional use permit. And they have to get approval to do that. Now, a variance is a property owner who wishes to go against a zoning ordinance or deviate from a zoning ordinance because of a unique circumstance. For example, let's just say a zoning ordinance for a certain area says all the houses have to be set back at least 20 feet from the street. But this particular property owner has a lot that falls off, 35 feet back. And if he built his house 20 feet back, he would actually fall off the back of his land, the back of his lot. He may provide evidence of that hardship to the city and ask for a variance and say, may I build my house 10 feet off the street so I don't fall off the backyard? So they call that a variance. And you still have to get approval from the city for that. But, and you have to provide evidence that it's the best use for that property and so on and so forth. But that's an example of a variance, and that's the difference between variance and conditional use. Conditional use is, I want to turn my property into something that's going to benefit all the houses around me, like a church or a school or whatever. And a variance is, can I please deviate from your zoning rule because I would otherwise not be able to use my property. So that's the best way that I can kind of differentiate the two, and you'll likely see a question with those terms intertwined. The for example on the top of page 117 it actually uses that exact example for applying for a variance. Okay? Now we're going to talk about some of the different types of zoning that exists in a community. One of them would be an overlay district. Overlay district is when two types of zoning are superimposed on the same area. So, for example, Highway 68 is commercially zoned, right? And it's all businesses and hotels and restaurants. But you also have it as a scenic corridor, right? So they have certain aesthetics that are required for businesses that are in that area. They have to have certain signs. They have to allow for, I think they have guidelines for like, that has to look a certain way, right? That's why it's called the scenic corridor. And that's merely two types of zoning, commercial and aesthetic, on top of each other. So overlay is just two types of zoning that are superimposed. You might also have residential area that is also designated as a flood zone. Okay, so that would be another example. One we see quite a bit here throughout our counties is historic preservation zoning. You see, whenever I think of historic preservation zoning, I think of Old Salem right away. Okay, what holiday season would be complete without a trip to Old Salem? But it's often a city's aspiring to preserve some of the things that make that city unique. Other areas in Guilford County that they have historic preservation, Sunset Hills, and in downtown Greensboro, and Battleground Park. So Battleground Park is also a historic preservation zoning area. In North Carolina, there can be areas zoned strictly for aesthetic purposes. Exteriors, when the exterior is regulated to look a certain way, certain colors. One of the places when I put aesthetic zoning in Google, for us, it popped up Oak Ridge right away. Okay, because the city or the town of Oak Ridge has certain requirements for all of the properties in Oak Ridge. Then you have spot zoning, which is when a particular property or group of properties is rezoned to permit a use different from the neighboring properties. So spot zoning can be a few property owners getting together and wanting to use their land for something else other than, let's say, residential where they are. In the area where I have my listing in Winston-Salem, that's a house but is now zoned for light business. It is my guess that sometime in the past, the property owners who owned where the Family Dollar is and the gas station got together and asked maybe for a spot zoning and said, hey, this is a really popular intersection. We should be able to put a business here. We should be able to sell our property for business. So sometimes when you see like Family Dollar and a couple of little businesses in a totally rural area that might ordinarily be zoned residential, or you would think is, they may have gotten approval for spot zoning or something like that. Spot zoning has to be applied for, has to be compatible with the neighboring areas. And again, when you're applying for zoning with the city and applying for different permits, the city is going to take a lot of due diligence to make sure that that is the best use for that area. So spot zoning can be, it can be legal and it can be done. On the next page, it talks about what is our duty to disclose zoning as real estate brokers. And like I mentioned before, we're not expected to be experts on where zoning or what all the zoning codes mean and what that means you can do. We are just expected to point our clients in the right direction, and we're expected to recognize if a property might be subject to restrictive covenants, which a lot of times new construction communities are. But you may find existing communities that you didn't think had restrictions, and they do. So we're expected to look that up and kind of make ourselves aware so we can make our clients aware. And And one of the other things that they expect us to do, and I'm in the second paragraph on page 118, is we're expected to, to properly disclose protective covenants if they're made. And one of the things not mentioned in this paragraph that we are expected to disclose is streets and whether or not they're private or publicly maintained. And we're going to talk a little bit about that on the next couple of pages, but that's a big one that comes up a lot in our responsibility. So, subdivision regulations. Let's go to the top of page 119 and talk about what the term subdivision means. We've all heard the term subdivision, right? I mean, we've heard it, we see them, we drive through them all the time. But in North Carolina, the state defines a subdivision as the division of a parcel or a tract of land into 2 or more lots for the purpose of sale or the purpose of building development. There are a couple of exceptions. So the exceptions, I feel like if you saw a test question, it might be regarding the exceptions. So put a little star under that VIP on the margin on the top of page 119. The 2 exceptions are if a division of land, if the land is divided and each parcel has more than 10 acres with no public street. Okay? So if you have tracts of land that are larger than 10 acres that don't have a street right-of-way dedication, like there's not a street being constructed that goes through them, that's not a subdivision. And number 2, a piece of land no larger than 2 acres that gets divided into less than 3 lots or 3 lots or less with no street throughway. When they say street right-of-way dedication, what they're basically saying is you're not creating sort of a publicly traveled street that's going to go through. Okay, so it's basically a dead end in a way. You could consider that a dead end. And that 3-lot tract is owned by the same person or a single entity. So put a little star there, know what the exceptions are, and know that when somebody does these, they're not subject to the same laws that subdivisions are typically subject to. Every subdivision is accompanied by a plat map. Okay? Plat map is the publicly recorded document. Now, plat maps are publicly recorded too, once they're approved fully by the city. The plat map is going to show how many lots are in the neighborhood. A plat map may even show if the street is public or private, how publicly or privately maintained. When I say public versus private, that's what I mean. So the plat map may even indicate the width of the street and whether or not it's who maintains it. One of the important things to note about the plat map is that if a new community is being built and there's a preliminary plat map, they usually do a preliminary plat and then they record a final plat. If they're doing that, property title on that street cannot transfer till the plat map is actually recorded. You may see that topic come up. They want us to know that plat maps have to be recorded for title to be transferred on that street or in that community. And the little gray box in the margin on the bottom gives us a good kind of in a nutshell as to what subdivision regulations are and why sometimes why those exceptions are so important. Because subdivision regulations get kind of strict. So it's good for us to know what the exceptions to that rule are. Moreover, if you turn your book to page 120, subdivision street disclosure, a developer of a new subdivision also has to say, are they going to have those streets be publicly or privately maintained? Some communities might have the HOA maintaining the street and not necessarily the city. So the city might require the developer to build the street to the city's standards, but those streets are actually going to be maintained by the HOA or by the homeowners. So the developer kind of has to put all these different plans in place when he's doing a subdivision. And you might see, and it took me a while to grip this one, I don't know why, but you might see the term PUD and subdivision used interchangeably because a PUD stands for Planned Unit Development. So I saw those used interchangeably somewhere, and one day I was just like, Jan, what's a PUD? And she just laughed at me. Boy, she got a real tickle, and she was like, wow, you don't know what a PUD is? And I was like, no, I don't. So, because you'll see that term, and I think they've even used it in here, but regardless, the point is that a developer has to disclose who's going to maintain the streets in his new development, okay? Now, I mentioned this, but I'm going to show you in the book where it says in that VIP in the middle section that just because streets are dedicated for public use and approved by the DOT, it doesn't mean the DOT is definitely maintaining them. So us as brokers, we should not assume just because the streets look public and they're, they can be publicly traveled, that the city is the one maintaining them or scraping them if they get snowy or icy, okay? I once had a listing in Winston-Salem, and I asked my client, I said, is this street public or private? And she was on a dead end with like 7 or 8 other lots. And she was like, oh, my street is public. And I can even show you that that's how it was disclosed to me when I bought the house. And she whipped out her 8-year-old offer to purchase where it had the check mark, her street was public. And I was like, oh, okay, your street is public. So I advertised her property as being on a publicly maintained street. And months went by, and I didn't get an offer. And I thought to myself, man, like, this is so weird, because she was in a great price point, great area. Well, one day it just came to me, sometimes when you're cooking or you're cleaning, you have these inspirational thoughts, right? And I thought, I should call the city and ask if this street is public or private. Because I don't know why, you just get a hunch. I called the city. I discovered that her street is in fact private. And when I went back and I told her, and I said, your street is actually privately maintained, and even though you're not in a subdivision, I have to advertise it as private. And she got so upset with me, and she didn't want me to advertise her street as private. And I said, but it is private, so we have to, because that's a material fact, which we're going to talk a lot about in the next few chapters. It's a material fact. It's pertinent to the transaction. Well, even though she wasn't in a subdivision that had a sign and a name, and there was no real evidence that it was a subdivision, once I discovered her street was private, I called my attorney that I work with. And I said, can you dig around and see if there are any regulations or restrictive covenants for these 7 lots? Because the street is private and I can't find any evidence of how it gets maintained. And my attorney does some digging, and sure enough, there are recorded covenants for this for these 7 lots on the dead end. And because I didn't have a name of a subdivision, I wasn't able to find them when I searched the public records. And so sure enough, once I disclosed that the street was private and disclosed the restrictive covenants that say the HOA that's in place is maintaining the street, I got an offer within 2 weeks. A really good offer. So it's almost more like the more you tell, the more likely you are to sell, really. So when it comes to disclosing streets being public or private, whether it's on the developer side or the broker side, you want to make as sure as sugar that you're disclosing the right thing. If I had sold the property and the buyer believed that the street was publicly maintained, I could have been liable for any damages that buyer might have incurred. But because I caught my mistake and I fixed my mistake and we conveyed the property under the right disclosure, it freed me from that liability. So I guess the moral of that story is, even if the seller tells you the streets are public, you always want to take that extra step and either call the city or look it up online if you can find the plat map of that area. Oftentimes you'll find out a street you thought was public is private. Now, moving right along to these next couple pages are like zoning ordinances and Board of Transportation requirements for developers. We're not going to read through this. If you have insomnia and can't fall asleep, you may want to read through that. It might help. But we are not going to go through that. Okay? So turn your book to page 123. So we were talking about the plat map and how the developer has to provide the city with a preliminary plat map, right? If he is in the preliminary plat map phase and he sells maybe 5 of those lots and he starts constructing property on those lots, right? So he still owns them, he's building houses on them, and then the plat map gets recorded. The commission wants us to know that, and this is in the middle of page 123, the sentence that starts with however. The commission wants us to be sure we know if there are any material changes from a preliminary plat to a final recorded plat. A buyer is allowed to cancel the existing contract and receive a full refund of all their money. For example, when I worked in a new construction community, we might have a preliminary plat, and they could potentially say, go ahead and write some contracts on those lots. We're going to have our plat recorded by next week. Okay, that's fine, because the law is that the property cannot transfer before the plat is recorded. So you could certainly put a contract on a piece of property, start building a house, and then have a recorded plat when you convey that title. Does that make sense? However, if the plat got recorded a week later, those 5 people that I put under contract to build a house on the lot, if there were any changes to the lot, like a crazy easement got added, or they lost some land of their lot, then those buyers will be entitled to cancel the contract and get all their money back that they might have put in. So the commission wants to make sure we know that, because new construction, that's something that can occur when you have buyer clients who are purchasing new construction. Going down the book, page 123, There are often restrictions in these planned unit developments. Subdivisions often have covenants and restrictions. They don't all have covenants and restrictions, but a lot of them do. And almost anything that's not illegal can be restricted. They can tell you how high to build or not build your fence, what color to build or not build your fence. They can tell you that if you put a storage shed, you have to match it to your house. They can tell you not to plant certain types of trees. Almost anything not illegal can be set in restrictive covenants. I have even seen HOA restrictive covenants that say the police will ride through the neighborhood a certain number of times on every single day. Because that maybe makes the neighborhood feel more secure. Either way, it's important to know that they can impose just about anything that's not illegal. You won't see restrictive covenants that say you cannot sell property in this neighborhood for the first year of ownership, because that would go against your basic freedom, right? So before we, let's see, when it comes to covenants and restrictions, that's going to be, and those are also publicly recorded too. So the same way that a deed is recorded, a plat map is recorded, covenants and restrictions will be recorded as well. Now, before we get into our next topic and take our break, are there any questions about any of the topics